Funny how the people who laugh the loudest are always the first to check their phones when silence hits. The private dining room on the 42nd floor glowed in soft amber light, the kind that made expensive whiskey look even richer and polished watches gleam like trophies under glass. And at the center of it all sat Richard Holloway's guests, a circle of men and women who moved billions of dollars before breakfast and treated it like a casual conversation over dinner, their voices low but confident, their laughter sharp, controlled, practiced, the sound of people who had never been told no long enough to forget what it felt like. And moving quietly between them, almost invisible, was Evelyn Carter, her black uniform crisp, her posture straight, her expression unreadable as she carried a tray of crystal glasses that cost more than most people's monthly rent, placing each one down with precise, effortless movements as if she had done this 1,000 times before, which she had, unnoticed, unremembered. Just another server in a room full of people who believed the world arranged itself for their convenience. And yet there was something about her stillness that didn't quite match the role, something in the way her eyes moved, not nervously, not submissively, but observant, measuring, as if she were listening to more than just their words, as if she were tracking patterns no one else in the room could see. "Miss," one of the guests called out without looking at her, snapping his fingers lightly against the table as if summoning a tool rather than a person. "What's the most expensive bottle you've ever served?" His tone carried amusement, the kind that invited others to join in, and they did. A few smirks, a quiet chuckle, a glance exchanged between two investors who already anticipated the answer would be wrong. Evelyn stopped beside him, her hands steady, her voice calm. "Depends on what you consider expensive, sir," she said, and for a brief moment, that answer hung in the air just long enough to disrupt the rhythm of their amusement, just enough to make one of them raise an eyebrow before the laughter returned, louder this time, sharper. "That's cute," another guest said, leaning back in his chair, swirling the last inch of bourbon in his glass. Philosophy from someone who carries plates. More laughter, this time joined by Richard himself, though his was quieter, more controlled, the kind of laugh that didn't need volume to assert dominance, his eyes flicking toward Evelyn not with curiosity, but with calculation, as if already deciding how far this little moment could be pushed. "Let's make it interesting," Richard said finally, placing his glass down with a soft, deliberate tap that immediately drew the room's attention, the conversations fading, the energy shifting toward him the way it always did. "Tell me," he continued, his voice smooth, almost casual, "do you understand money?" The question landed differently, not just a joke now, but a setup, a stage being built in real time, and Evelyn met his gaze for the first time, not challenging, not submissive, just present. "Enough to know it's not always where people think it is," she replied, and this time, the silence lasted a fraction longer, a subtle pause that only someone paying close attention would notice, before Richard smiled, slow, deliberate. "Good," he said, reaching into his jacket and placing a sleek black card on the table, the kind that didn't need branding to announce its weight. "Then let's play a small game," he added, glancing around at his guests who leaned in slightly, sensing entertainment, sensing control. "You use this," he gestured toward the card, "and show us what you think money really is." And just like that, the room tilted, the laughter returning, but now sharper, expectant, waiting for the moment she would fail, because in their world, people like her always did, and Evelyn, without a word, reached for the card, her fingers brushing its surface lightly, her expression unchanged, as if nothing in the room had shifted at all, as if the game had already ended before it even began. The card rested in Evelyn's hand for a moment longer than necessary, not because she hesitated, but because she was listening, not to the voices in the room, not to the quiet laughter that still lingered at the edges of the table, but to the subtle rhythm. Beneath it all, the faint vibration of phones placed face down on polished wood, the soft hum of devices sinking silently in the background, the invisible network that connected every person in that room more tightly than their conversation ever could. And when she finally moved, it was slow, deliberate, almost unremarkable, as if she were simply continuing her job, as if nothing about this moment carried any weight at all. She stepped toward the payment terminal station discreetly at the side console, her movements smooth, practiced, her posture unchanged. And yet Richard's eyes followed her now, not out of amusement, but out of something quieter, something sharper, the first hint that this might not unfold the way he had expected. "Take your time," one of the guests said with a grin, leaning back in his chair, fingers drumming lightly against the table. "Would not want you to get overwhelmed." A few more chuckles, softer this time, less certain, because something in the air had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm when the wind goes still, and even the most confident voices lower without knowing why. Evelyn did not respond. She simply placed the card against the reader, the screen lighting up with a soft glow that reflected briefly in her eyes. Numbers flickering across the display, transaction prompts appearing in clean, clinical text, and for a second, it looked exactly like what they expected, a waitress following instructions. Pressing buttons she barely understood, participating in a game she was meant to lose. But then her finger paused above the screen, not hovering, not uncertain, just waiting, as if aligning with something unseen, and then she tapped. Once, a small, almost insignificant motion that made no sound at all, no dramatic confirmation, no alert, nothing that would signal change to anyone not paying very close attention. She removed the card, set it gently back on the table in front of Richard, and stepped back into her place as if the moment had already passed, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere far beyond that room. "That is it?" another guest asked, raising an eyebrow, his tone halfway between disappointment and disbelief. "No speech, no explanation?" Evelyn met his gaze briefly, her expression calm, almost neutral. "You asked what money really is," she said quietly. I answered. The simplicity of it landed strangely, not dramatic enough to dismiss, not clear enough to understand, and for a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Richard exhaled a soft laugh, shaking his head slightly as he reached for his glass. "Well," he said, his voice returning to its earlier confidence. "That was certainly underwhelming." The tension broke, the room easing back into itself, conversations beginning to rise again, glasses clinking softly, the illusion of control settling back over the table like a familiar coat. And then, almost casually, one of the guests picked up his phone, perhaps to check a message, perhaps to confirm a transfer, perhaps simply out of habit, and his expression changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that spread slowly across his face. Confusion first, then disbelief, his thumb tapping the screen once, twice, as if the device had made a mistake. "That is strange," he muttered under his breath, not loud enough to interrupt the room. Not yet, but enough for the person beside him to glance over. Enough for a second phone to be picked up, another screen to light, another pause, longer this time, heavier, the kind that does not belong in a room like this. And Evelyn, standing just a few feet away, said nothing, did nothing. She simply watched, her eyes steady, her breathing even, as the first cracks began to form in a world that had always believed itself unbreakable. The first man stood up too quickly, his chair scraping softly against the polished floor, the sound small, but sharp enough to slice through the room's returning chatter. And now everyone noticed, not because of the noise, but because of his face, the color draining just enough to betray something was wrong. "It is probably just a delay," he said, more to himself than anyone else, his thumb tapping rapidly against his phone screen as if speed alone could force reality back into place. But the numbers did not change, the message did not disappear, and across the table, another guest lifted her phone, her expression mirroring his within seconds, confusion tightening into something more rigid, something closer to concern. "That is not possible," she murmured, her voice low but no longer amused. And like a quiet signal passed between them, more devices appeared, screens lighting up one after another, reflections flickering across glassware and polished silver, each face shifting in the same slow progression, certainty to doubt, doubt to disbelief, disbelief to something they were not used to feeling, not in a room like this, not with people like them. "Check your network," someone said quickly, grasping for explanation. It might be a system glitch, but the words sounded thinner than they should have, less convincing even as they were spoken, because these were not people unfamiliar with systems. They understood infrastructure, risk, failure points. And what they were seeing did not behave like a glitch, it behaved like intent, controlled, precise. Synchronized, Richard did not reach for his phone immediately. He watched instead, his gaze moving from one guest to another, tracking reactions, measuring the shift in energy the same way he would analyze a market turning against him, his expression still composed, but his fingers now resting flat against the table instead of loosely around his glass. And when he finally picked up his phone, it was with the same deliberate calm he applied to every decision that mattered. He unlocked it, glanced at the screen, and for the first time that evening, his eyes did not move for a full second longer than they should have. Not dramatic, not obvious, just enough, a pause that only someone standing very still would notice. Evelyn did not look at his phone. She did not need to. She was watching his breathing instead, the slight change in rhythm, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. The moment a man who controlled outcomes realized he was no longer in control of this one. "What did you do?" he asked finally, his voice quiet, not raised, not angry, but stripped of the earlier amusement, stripped down to something more direct, more honest, and every conversation in the room stopped, not because he demanded it, but because they needed to hear the answer. Evelyn met his gaze again, steady, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed around her while the rest of the room sped up. "Nothing you did not ask for," she replied, her tone even, almost gentle, and that answer unsettled them more than any explanation could have, because it did not deny, it did not defend. It simply reframed the moment in a way that left no room to step outside of it. One of the guests shook his head, frustration breaking through now. "This is not funny," he said, louder than before, his voice carrying the first real edge of urgency. "These accounts handle real transactions, real money." Evelyn's eyes shifted to him briefly, calm, precise. "Exactly," she said, and the weight of that single word settled heavier than anything else spoken that night, because for the first time, they were no longer laughing at her, they were listening. And somewhere between those two states, the balance of the room had already changed. No one reached for their drinks anymore. The glasses sat untouched, catching the light, but no longer reflecting ease, and the room that had once felt controlled now felt contained, like something unseen had quietly closed around them without a sound. One of the guests let out a short breath and stood, pacing a few steps as if movement alone could restore order. "There has to be an explanation," he said, his voice tighter now, stripped of its earlier confidence. "Systems do not just shut down. Like this." Evelyn remained where she was, hands loosely folded in front of her, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that contrasted sharply with the shifting energy around her. "They do," she said calmly, "when they are designed to." The words did not rise, did not press, but they landed with precision, drawing Richard's full attention now, his gaze sharpening, recalibrating, as if he were finally seeing her not as a role, but as a variable he had failed to account for. "Designed by who?" he asked, each word measured, deliberate, and for the first time, there was no audience in his tone, no performance, just a direct question from someone used to understanding. Systems down to their foundation. Evelyn took a small step forward, not closing the distance completely, but enough to shift the dynamic, enough to make it clear she was no longer part of the background. "By people who understand how they fail," she replied, her eyes holding his without challenge, without submission, just clarity. One of the guests let out a short, incredulous laugh, though it lacked the sharpness it had before. "You expect us to believe that you did this," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the glowing phone still in their hands, "that a waitress can access financial networks at this level." Evelyn's gaze moved to him briefly, then back to Richard, as if the answer did not belong to the room, but to the only person beginning to ask the right question. "I did not access anything," she said. "I built the architecture that allows access." The sentence shifted the air again, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet weight of something that could not be easily dismissed. Richard's expression did not change immediately, but something in his eyes did, a flicker of recognition, faint at first, then sharper, as if a memory had just aligned with the present. "That is not possible," another guest said quickly, almost reflexively. "Those systems are proprietary, developed by—" He stopped mid-sentence, the realization catching up with him before he could finish. And Richard's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table, not enough to be obvious. Just enough to mark the moment internally. "Carter," he said slowly, testing the name as if it carried more weight than he had allowed earlier. "Evelyn Carter." His gaze narrowed slightly, not in suspicion now, but in recollection. "There was a proposal," he continued, more to himself than to her. 3 years ago. A structural redesign for cross-bank transaction validation. Something about layered authorization and conditional lock sequences. Evelyn did not nod, did not confirm. She simply waited, giving him the space to arrive at the conclusion on his own, because that was where the real shift happened, not in what she said, but in what he realized. Richard exhaled quietly, the sound almost lost in the stillness of the room. "We passed on it," he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty. And for the first time that night, there was something unfamiliar in it. Not fear, not yet, but the clear absence of control. Evelyn's expression softened just slightly, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with something closer to understanding. "You did," she said, her tone even. "You said it was unnecessary, too cautious, too expensive." She paused briefly, just long enough for the weight of those words to settle. "You said the system was already strong enough." Silence followed, deeper this time, heavier, because now the situation was no longer abstract, no longer a glitch or an anomaly. It had a history, a decision, a moment where it could have gone differently. And in that silence, the room understood something none of them had expected to face. That the person they had dismissed minutes ago was not outside their system. She was part of the reason it existed at all. The silence did not break this time. It settled, heavier than before, pressing into the edges of the room where confidence used to live, and no one reached for an explanation now because they already had one. It was standing in front of them, composed, unshaken, and entirely out of place in the role they had assigned her. One of the guests slowly lowered his phone onto the table as if it had become something fragile, something unreliable. "If what you are saying is true," he began, his voice measured but strained beneath the surface, "then you can reverse it." It was not a question, it was an expectation, the kind built from years of believing that every problem had a price and every solution could be negotiated. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She let the words exist on their own for a moment, let the assumption behind them reveal itself fully before she responded. "Of course," she said calmly, and several shoulders in the room loosened slightly, a subtle shift, relief trying to return, but it did not last, because she continued. "Systems that can be locked can be unlocked." Her tone remained even, almost instructional. "The difference is who is allowed to do it." The room tightened again, the relief replaced by something more uncertain, something that did not fit into their usual equations. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, not retreating, but recalibrating, his mind clearly moving through possibilities, leverage, control points. "Then let us not waste time," he said, his voice steady but lower now, more focused. "Tell me what you want." It was the first real negotiation offered that night, stripped of performance, stripped of arrogance. Direct, efficient, the language he understood best. Evelyn studied him for a brief moment, not assessing his wealth, not his status, but the shift in his posture, the absence of the earlier amusement, the presence of something closer to respect, or at least recognition. "What makes you think this is about wanting something?" she asked softly, and the question disrupted him in a way no demand could have, because it removed the framework he relied on. One of the guests exhaled sharply, impatience breaking through again. "Everything is about something," he said, his voice rising slightly. "No one does this for nothing." Evelyn's gaze moved to him, steady, unhurried. "That is exactly the assumption that creates systems like yours," she replied, and the words did not accuse. They explained, which made them harder to dismiss, harder to argue with, because they were not aimed at a person, but at a pattern. Richard's fingers tapped once against the table, a small, controlled motion. "Then, explain it to me," he said, leaning forward now, not aggressively, but with intent. "If this is not about money, not about leverage, then what is it about?" Evelyn glanced briefly at the row of phones, still glowing with restricted messages, then back at him. It is about understanding the difference between access and control, she said, her voice quiet but clear. You have spent years believing they are the same thing. She paused, letting the idea settle, letting it move through a room full of people who built empires on that belief. They are not. Another silence followed, but this one was different, not heavy, not oppressive, but focused, as if the room had narrowed down to a single point of attention. Richard's expression shifted slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that comes when a model you trusted no longer explains what you are seeing. So this is a lesson, he said slowly, testing the word, not mocking it, just examining it. Evelyn did not smile. She did not nod. She simply held his gaze. Call it whatever you need to understand it, she said, and in that moment, the balance of power did not shift loudly. It settled quietly, firmly, into a place none of them had anticipated when the night began. No one interrupted her this time, not because they agreed, but because they no longer knew where to insert themselves into the conversation. The usual patterns had broken, the rhythm they relied on had slipped just enough to leave them uncertain, and in that uncertainty, Evelyn remained the only constant in the room, still, composed, as if she had already seen this moment long before it arrived. One of the guests cleared his throat, attempting to regain some ground. If this is about control, he said, choosing his words more carefully now, then you have made your point. His voice carried restraint, but also impatience, the kind that comes from being forced into unfamiliar territory. You have demonstrated capability. Now restore access, and we can discuss whatever terms you have in mind. The statement was structured, logical, almost reasonable, but it carried the same underlying assumption that everything returned to negotiation, that every imbalance could be corrected through agreement. Evelyn turned her attention to him, her expression unchanged. You are still thinking in transactions, she said quietly, and the simplicity of it made the flaw obvious in a way that no argument could. The man paused, his response forming and then dissolving before it could be spoken, because for the first time, he was not certain it would hold. Richard watched the exchange closely, not stepping in yet, allowing the moment to unfold, studying it the way he would study a system under stress, identifying where it held and where it broke, then changed the frame. He said finally, his voice calm, controlled, but no longer dominant, explain it in a way that does not rely on transactions. Evelyn shifted her gaze back to him, acknowledging the request not as authority, but as understanding. You built a system designed to move value quickly, she began, her tone steady, almost analytical now. Speed, scale, efficiency, those were your priorities. A few of the guests nodded slightly, reflexively, because that part was familiar, safe. But you removed friction without understanding what friction protects, she continued, and now the room leaned in, not physically, but mentally, because this was language they understood, just not from her. Friction forces verification. It slows decisions just enough to reveal risk. She paused briefly, letting the idea settle. Without it, you created something that works perfectly until the moment it does not. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition. The kind that arrives when someone articulates a weakness you had chosen to ignore. So you introduced friction, he said, not as a challenge, but as a conclusion. Evelyn gave a slight nod, the first visible acknowledgement she had offered. Conditional friction, she corrected. Only when certain patterns appear. Only when access is used without awareness of consequence. One of the guests shook his head slowly, the realization catching up to him in fragments. You are saying this was always possible, he said, his voice quieter now, less certain. Evelyn met his gaze. I am saying it was always predictable, she replied, and that distinction landed deeper than anything else she had said, because it removed chance from the equation entirely. This was not an accident, not an anomaly. It was an outcome. Richard exhaled slowly, his hand resting flat against the table again, no longer tapping, no longer calculating in the same way. And tonight triggered it, he said, more statement than question. Evelyn did not hesitate. Yes, she said, and the room absorbed that single word with a weight that could not be negotiated away, because it meant the system had not failed them. It had responded to them exactly as it was designed to do. And for the first time, They were not dealing with a problem they could solve. They were facing a reflection of their own design. The realization did not explode. It settled, quiet and undeniable, moving across the table not through words but through the absence of them. And for the first time that evening, no one tried to correct it, no one tried to outtalk it, because the system they trusted had not betrayed them, it had reflected them, and that was harder to argue with. One of the guests slowly leaned back in his chair, his earlier confidence replaced by something more measured, more cautious. Then what exactly triggered it? He asked, his tone no longer dismissive, but careful, as if the answer might require more attention than he was used to giving. Evelyn did not rush her response. She let the question sit, not to create tension, but to allow understanding to catch up with the moment. Pattern recognition, she said finally, her voice calm, precise. The system monitors sequences, not individual actions. It looks for alignment between behavior and authority. She glanced briefly at the table, at the arrangement of cards, devices, identities that had once defined the room. Tonight, those patterns did not match. Richard's eyes remained fixed on her, not interrupting, not challenging, just following, the way someone does when they realize the explanation matters more than their reaction to it. You had access, Evelyn continued, but you used it without awareness, without constraint, treating it as proof of control rather than responsibility. One of the guests let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. We were having dinner, he said, though the statement sounded thinner than it should have. You were testing someone. Evelyn corrected gently, not raising her voice, not pressing the point, just placing it where it belonged. You reduced a person to a variable in a system you believed you understood. The words were simple, but they carried weight because they did not exaggerate, they did not accuse. They described, and in that description, the room saw itself more clearly than it had before. Richard's posture shifted slightly, not defensive, not aggressive, just more grounded, as if he had stopped trying to control the situation and started trying to understand it. So the system responded to behavior, not status, he said, his voice steady, but quieter now. Evelyn gave a small nod. Status is just a label, she replied. The system evaluates patterns, consistency, intent. She paused briefly, her gaze moving across the table, meeting each pair of eyes without lingering. And tonight, the pattern was clear. Silence followed again. But this time it was different, not tense, not uncertain, but reflective, as if each person in the room was replaying the last hour in their mind, seeing it from a perspective they had not considered before. One of the guests looked down at his phone again, not tapping, not trying to fix anything, just looking at the message as if it had changed meaning, as if it were no longer an error, but a statement. Richard exhaled slowly, his hand no longer gripping the edge of the table, now resting flat, steady. And if the pattern changes, he asked, not as a demand, not as a negotiation, but as a genuine inquiry. Evelyn met his gaze, her expression calm, unshaken. Then the system responds differently, she said, and the simplicity of the answer made it more powerful than any condition could have, because it did not offer a shortcut, it did not promise immediate resolution, it pointed to something deeper, something that could not be bought or commanded, only understood. And in that moment, the room shifted again, not back to what it was, but forward into something quieter, more aware, where control was no longer assumed, but questioned, and where the person they had overlooked was now the only one who truly understood the system they all depended on. No one spoke immediately after her answer, not because there was nothing left to say, but because for the first time, they understood that speaking would not change the outcome, and in that stillness, something unfamiliar settled into the room, not fear, not quite, but a quiet awareness that control had shifted into a place they could not reach with words or influence. One of the guests slowly picked up his glass, then set it back down without drinking, the motion incomplete, as if even small actions now required more certainty than he could access. Richard remained still, his gaze steady on Evelyn, but no longer searching for leverage, no longer calculating advantage. Instead, he was observing, absorbing, the way someone does when they realize the rules they have relied on no longer apply. If the system responds to patterns, he said after a moment, his voice measured, stripped of its earlier edge, then it should also recognize correction. It was not a demand, not even a negotiation. It was an attempt to understand the boundary he had just discovered. Evelyn considered him briefly, not evaluating his status, but the shift in his approach, the absence of performance, the presence of intention. It does, she replied, her tone even. But correction is not a statement. It is a sequence. The distinction hung in the air, subtle but precise. One of the guests frowned slightly, trying to follow. Meaning what? He asked, quieter now, less certain. Evelyn's eyes moved to him for a moment, then back to Richard. Meaning the system does not respond to what you say you are. It responds to what you consistently do, she said, and that answer landed deeper than any technical explanation could have, because it removed the possibility of immediate resolution. It replaced it with something slower, something that could not be forced. Richard exhaled slowly, his posture no longer rigid, no longer anchored in control, but grounded in something closer to acceptance. So, this does not change tonight, he said, not as a complaint, but as a realization. Evelyn gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Tonight already happened, she said, and the finality of that sentence carried more weight than any locked account, because it meant the system was not reacting in real time. It was reflecting a completed pattern. One of the guests looked down at his phone again, not with urgency now, but with understanding. The message no longer felt like an interruption, it felt like a conclusion. And tomorrow, Richard asked, his voice steady, quieter than before, if the pattern is different. Evelyn met his gaze, calm, unwavering. Then the system will reflect that, she said. And for the first time, the answer did not create tension. It created space, not comfort, but clarity, the kind that replaces panic with awareness. Richard leaned back slightly, his hand resting flat on the table, no longer gripping, no longer tapping, just present. And after a moment, he reached forward, not for his phone, not for his glass, but for the black card he had placed there earlier, the same card that had started the game. And he looked at it differently now, not as a symbol of control, but as a tool within a system he no longer fully understood. Then he set it down again, gently, without emphasis, and that small, quiet gesture carried more meaning than anything he had said that night, because it was the first time he had chosen not to use it. And across the table, the others followed in subtle ways, phones placed face down, hands resting still, conversations absent, not forced into silence, but choosing it. And in that silence, Evelyn remained exactly as she had been. From the beginning, calm, composed, unchanged, not because nothing had happened, but because everything had unfolded exactly as she expected. The room did not return to what it had been. It could not. Something fundamental had shifted, not in the system alone, but in the way each person now understood their place within it. And in that quiet, deliberate stillness, Richard finally stood, not abruptly, not to reclaim attention, but with a calm that carried a different kind of authority, one no longer rooted in control, but in recognition. Miss Carter, he said, his voice steady, no longer layered with performance. Evelyn, he corrected himself after a brief pause, and the adjustment, small as it was, did not go unnoticed, because names mattered differently now, not as labels, but as acknowledgments. You built something we chose not to understand, he continued, his gaze meeting hers without distance, without dismissal. And tonight, we experienced the cost of that decision. No one interrupted him, not because they were waiting for permission, but because they understood this moment was not about interruption, it was about listening. Evelyn held his gaze, her expression unchanged, not expecting anything, not requiring anything, simply present. If the system reflects patterns, Richard said, choosing his words carefully, then the only meaningful response is to change them. It was not a question, not a negotiation, but a statement shaped by understanding rather than assumption. Evelyn gave a slight nod, the smallest acknowledgement, but enough, because it confirmed that he had finally stepped outside the framework he had relied on. One of the guests shifted in his seat, then slowly set his phone down again, this time with intention, not frustration, not resignation, but awareness. And across the table, others followed in subtle ways, shoulders lowering, movements slowing, the urgency replaced by something quieter, more deliberate. Richard glanced briefly at the black card resting on the table, then back at Evelyn. "There is no immediate fix," he said, more to the room than to her. And this time, no one argued, because they understood why. Evelyn stepped back, slightly, returning to the edge of the space she had occupied from the beginning, not retreating, but restoring the balance in a way that felt natural, inevitable. "Systems do not respond to urgency," she said softly. "They respond to consistency." Her voice carried no judgment, no edge, just clarity, the kind that did not need to be reinforced, because it had already been demonstrated. Richard inclined his head slightly, not as a gesture of submission, but of respect, the kind that is given when understanding replaces assumption. "Then consistency it is," he said, and for the first time that evening, the words felt grounded, not strategic, not calculated, but real. Evelyn reached for the check presenter resting quietly at the side, placed it on the table with the same steady precision she had shown at the beginning of the night, as if the entire sequence of events had not altered the simplicity of the act. "Your evening is concluded," she said, her tone unchanged, professional, composed, and yet the meaning behind it carried far beyond the room. No one moved immediately, not out of hesitation, but because the moment did not require movement, it required acknowledgement, and in that stillness, something unspoken passed between them. Not agreement, not resolution, but understanding. Evelyn turned, her steps quiet against the polished floor, moving toward the door without urgency, without pause, and no one called after her. No one tried to stop her, because there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to prove. She reached the threshold, her hand resting briefly on the handle before she stepped out into the hallway beyond. And as the door closed softly behind her, the room remained silent, not empty, but changed. And in that silence, the lesson settled fully, not in the system, not in the accounts, but in the people who had just learned, without noise, without force, that power is not proven by access, but by the discipline to understand it.